I'm Laura Chandler of the Foundation of the Sacred Stream and the Sacred Stream Radio podcast, speaking with Lama Tsultrim for the Wisdom in Exile Conference. And Lama Tsultrim is an author, teacher, and founder of Tara Mandala Retreat Center in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. And Lama Tsultrim, I would like to start with a question that is at the heart of the Wisdom in Exile Conference, and that is, what is Tibetan Buddhism? Or perhaps more specifically, what makes Tibetan Buddhism Tibetan?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think it's the only Buddhism that's defined by the country that it's from. Mm-hmm. But we don't talk about Thai Buddhism or Japanese, we talk about Zen or Vipassana, Theravada. And perhaps that's because Tibetan Buddhism is so Tibetan. In the sense that it's very culturally specific in many ways and very culturally complex. And so in Tibet we have basically three streams. One is the Buddhism from India. One is the native Tibetan Bön tradition. And the other is the Chinese influences, Chinese Buddhist influences in Tibet. And so when Buddhism came into Tibet in the 8th century, it brought with it the tantric tradition, because that was what was happening in India at the time, and mainly Sarvastivada and Mahayana. And that was a time when the Pala kings were in charge in India. So it was sort of like Vajrayana was the state religion at that point. And so that's what was being taught in, not exclusively, but it was being taught in the various Buddhist universities and so on. And so you already have a step of about, the Buddha was 500 BC, this is the 8th century. So, many hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha is when Buddhism went to Tibet, which means it had all those influences that came into Buddhism before that, which were, of course, the original 18 schools from the time of the Buddha, and then Mahayana, which developed around the turn of the millennium. And then Tantra or Vajrayana or Esoteric Buddhism, which developed around, or sort of really came to the fore around the 8th century. So you have that, and then the Bön tradition, which is actually very interesting. It sort of gets a bad name and by some scholars and so on, but Bön had a lot of different levels as well. And there were certainly levels of black magic and sacrifice and so on. But there's also a Dzogchen lineage in Bön, which is very powerful. And many people have reached rainbow body, which is, of course, the disappearance of the corpse at the time of death through the Dzogchen from Bön. And so all those factors combined to create what became Tibetan Buddhism.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. We have Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who's a teacher of Bön, the Bön tradition, who's participating in this. And just speaking a little on Bön, I know that His Holiness has stated clearly that Bön is part of Tibetan Buddhism, and which I think is helpful to that lineage, and it's an important lineage too. So thank you for bringing that history forward and the connections of all the traditions. Well, you have a fascinating story, and you were the first American ordained by His Holiness the 16th Karmapa. And you've studied with many of the great teachers that have escaped Tibet. And you've also traveled parts of the US with Ram Dass and Allen Ginsberg. So
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what drew you to Tibetan Buddhism?
Well, I think the simplest answer would be karma. But the story is that I first came across a book by Carl Jung, at the end of my high school years. And it had Tibetan mandala on the cover, and inside there were Tibetan mandalas. And I was an artist. And so I was interested in the mandalas as art. And I was interested in the effect that it had on me to look at those mandalas. And so it's almost like, you know, when you look at a mandala, you go into the center. It's almost like that was my gate. The center of the mandala was my gate into Tibetan Buddhism. And then I was fortunate to go to Nepal first, and then ultimately Dharamsala in India in 1967, and met actual Tibetans. And for me, what struck me so much about them was, here's a people, this was, you know, less than 10 years after the Dalai Lama had left. And so Dharamsala was very different than it is now. It was just sort of pounded kerosene can houses and, you know, lined with newspaper, and really shacks that the Tibetans were living in. And what struck me was, here are these people who had really lost everything, left everything behind, and yet they had so much joy. And many of them had seen their families killed in front of them, or their monasteries destroyed, and absolute atrocities and trauma, but they didn't act traumatized. They just radiated a kind of joy and peace that I'd never experienced in my life, even coming from a very affluent country where people should be happy. And so that was, I think the Tibetan people were what really drew me to Tibetan Buddhism.
That's really interesting. Well, in this idea of wisdom being in exile, you know, there's a lot that changes with it being spread around the world, and it having influences on societies like ours, and the effect it has on the Tibetan experience also, and it being spread about. And I'm wondering if you would just say some things about, or speak to the idea of the importance of preserving Tibetan Buddhist practice for the future.
Well, I would say that Tibetan Buddhism is really the most esoteric tradition in the world. There was a form of esoteric Christianity and Judaism, there still is to some extent, but a lot of that esoteric tradition has been lost. Whereas in Tibet, it wasn't lost. It was preserved and lived. And so what does that mean? It means that it's not a religion that's based on simply beliefs, do what the priest says or the minister or whatever, and there won't be any real signs of fruition in terms of your prayers. Perhaps they'll be answered in one way or another. But esoteric tradition has, it's almost like a science of psychophysical development. And so Tibetan Buddhism, because of all the influences that were part of it, has also a yogic tradition that's very strong coming from India. And so I've been now actually in 2 years, it will be 50 years since I was ordained.
Wow.
So I have been studying this a long time and practicing a long time. And yet I still feel like a beginner. I still feel like there's so much I don't know because there's so much. and you know, we have a Tibetan library at Taramandala, and so much hasn't been translated. And we do something called Drupchen at Taramandala, which is a 10-day ceremony that's sort of like the pinnacle of Vajrayana, extremely complex ceremonies, 4 different fire pujas with different kinds of wood that all have to be carved a certain way and has to be a certain kind of wood. And anyway, those kind of details, which might seem sort of, oh, that's just culture, why does that matter, and so on. But one time there was a Tibetan Lama here teaching, and he was teaching one of these complex Vajrayana practices with lots of visualizations and hand gestures, mudras, and so on. And somebody said, why does it have to be so complicated? And he said, look, you know, I came here by jet. There were so many things that went into creating that jet, so many little details. But once it was done, it flew. And so I think Vajrayana is a little bit like that it does have so many details, and the richness of it is really quite extraordinary. And to lose that level of esoteric also means the inner transformation process is not an outer, I mean, it has outer aspects, but the deeper meaning of things, the symbolic meaning and so on, those things are very, very rich in Tibetan culture, and therefore Tibetan Buddhism, because it's almost saying the same thing, Tibetan culture and Tibetan Buddhism. It's really impossible to separate them. So to lose that would be tragic, really, in terms of sort of like world heritage.
It's true. And you're hitting on this really important aspect of preserving these deep, rich, you know, as you said, 50 years and you feel like a beginner, practices and study and transmissions, and preserving that. And then also the other level, sort of reaching out into the world, and is having effect on our society, let's say. It's, you know, how do we, you know, and is it possible to preserve those deep, rich practices and also have the what I want to call ameliorative effects of you know, understanding Buddhist philosophy or practicing meditation and kinds of things. So I'm kind of getting to the question of how do we preserve these things? What needs to be preserved in what way? Like, so you've described some texts, like what texts and practices need to be preserved in a particular way, and then which practices can be brought forward and taught to novices and hopefully help us, you know, create a better world.
I think it's an arc where you have the practices that have been adapted or made more accessible for the Western world. So that's one end of the arc. And then there's the other end of the arc, which is the absolute traditional. And one doesn't preclude the other. I think both are really important. And that's why I do both. Personally, I teach very traditional practice, such as the Nundro and Yidam practices and so on. But I also have made an effort to make certain practices accessible in the West, like the 5-step process of feeding your demons, which derives from the 11th century woman's teacher Machi Lapton's chip practice, is just now the University of California, two neuroscientists, Eve Ekman and Felipe Golden, one from UC Davis and one from UC San Francisco, have just completed a pilot study on the effectiveness of feeding your demons for addiction, depression, and anxiety. And it's proving to be very effective, actually, in a clinical study. And so those, that's an made accessible version of the chip practice. And I've also done that with the mandala in my new book, appreciating, of course, the precision of the measurement and so on of an actual traditional mandala, but how do we extract that into something that's actually helping a lot of people? And so that's been my sort of, I've kind of lived that arc. And I think that's important. Another practice which has can be made more accessible and has been is shamatha or shine practice, peaceful abiding practice, of which is a sort of meditation practice that's a little bit more normal. And when we think of meditation, there's no words and no chanting, no bells and whistles. And so that, and then the teachings of compassion that are the base of the Mahayana. For example, the mind training teachings, Lojong, teachings of Atisha, Lojong teachings, Dong Khyentse Wangpo taught that extensively. It's just really how can we turn our minds and create a more passionate and compassionate base for our lives. And there's a lot that can be applied from those teachings to just anybody. It don't have to be Buddhist, and can be taught in a way that you wouldn't even know it was Buddhist. And I think Pema Chodron's books have done a wonderful job with that. And those are some of the ways that it can be made accessible. And I think it's important to hold that arc of both. There's a story that I always think of when we have this discussion about, preservation versus innovation, or making the tradition more, you could say, westernized or accessible. That is in the Theravadan tradition happened, where the two principal Vipassana teachers in the United States were Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein. And Jack was a therapist and was teaching in California and was, using Rumi and, all kinds of different things, from sort of adapting Vipassana and making it more accessible. And Joseph was very traditional and sort of by the book in the Theravadan tradition. And so there was kind of a conflict developing of who was right and how should it be. And so they had a meeting in California, and they had a facilitator come in, and so they asked Joseph to leave the room. And then they asked Jack and everyone else, how does that feel to have Joseph gone? So now you're not dealing with this super traditional thing. You can experiment as much as you like. Nobody's going to say anything. And then people, said how they felt. And then Jack left, and they did the same thing. And what they realized when they all came back together was that when Jack was gone, this innovative approach was gone, and nobody really wanted that to be gone. And the same with Joseph. And so then they realized that actually they were both holding something important, and that it wasn't a right or wrong situation. It was a yes and.
That's a really great story, and it illustrates that point. And what you describe as holding the ark, I love that description of holding the ark of both the depth of the esoteric tradition and the bridging of making it accessible. And I think it's great that you've got a study. I know Eve, and I don't know the other person,
Oh,
but
you do?
yeah. So that they've done a study proving the effectiveness. I'd love to hear more about how you're bridging Chod practices and the mandala practice.